Hello, my name is Nertatis Cingetos. I'll be talking about divine pairings today. See, earlier this year, I started looking into Gaulish Diana, and I found that many of the sources talking about her referenced divine pairings. In Gaul, she was paired with Sylvanus, and in one instance with his syncretism, Sucellos. It sent me down a rabbit hole, as many topics in Gaulish polytheism do, about these pairings. There are dozens of them across Gaul, but it's not a form of worship that's been explored much in modern Gaulish polytheism, not that I've seen. So I thought I'd dig a bit deeper. I immediately found a prominent reason why these pairings are often skipped over. Divine pairings in Gaul usually took the form of a Roman god and a Celtic goddess. This form has led early archaeologists to deem these pairings a sort of religious act of dominance from patriarchal Rome, based on the views of gender and marriage expressed by Roman authors at the time. This form of worship, obviously, it just doesn't fit with Gaulish polytheism today, which rejects chauvinism in all of its forms. But these theories ignore a very basic component of ancient Gallo-Roman religion, the Gaulish half of it, by making assumptions about the Gaulish province, an extremely diverse province in culture and religion, based solely on the views of Rome, no matter how influential the capital was. These scholars really do a massive disservice to these cult practices. I'll draw a parallel to the Jupiter columns of the Rhineland, like the one shown here. The Rhineland, Brittany, and Auvergne, which early scholars also deemed a monument of dominance, this time of Rome over the Germanic barbarians. But the truth is much more complex. For one, ignoring the large Gaulish presence in the Rhineland and the names of the Gauls that erected these. And secondly, reducing the symbolism to one of Roman conquest. Personally, after digging into comparative mythology and other interpretations, I see the imagery as a visualization of the Celtic natural order. The sky above represented by Jupiter, maybe Jupiter Tyrannus, the land below represented by the horse, and the underworld firmly below represented by the snake-legged giant. The idea of the sky falling upon the Gauls' heads seems to be referenced here. So when I saw the divine pairings reference like this, I'm hesitant to ascribe this cult of dominance to divine couples in Gaul, where, unlike the Greco-Roman world, we don't have writings about gender perceptions or myths about these relationships to determine what they might represent. Sadly, due to this marriage of dominance theory, most sources focus on male-female pairings, and I just didn't have enough time to really dig into all of them, never mind same-sex pairings, and if they fit the same mold that we'll see as we go through the pairings. But I did manage to find some information about the validity of this dominance theory. And unsurprisingly, Miranda Green played a big part of that and gives us a good base to examine these images. First thing we can look at when considering if the male consorts in these pairings is dominant is the size of the figures. Apparently, Gallo-Roman art tends to depict male figures as slightly larger than female figures, but this rule doesn't hold up with divine pairings. The vast majority of divine pairing art in Gaul shows equally sized figures, like this Rosmerta and Mercury that's quite deteriorated, regardless of gender. Some exceptions exist, but mostly we see significantly smaller figures presented alongside either the pairing or a single, probably divine figure like this carving that might also be Rosmerta. In some cases, the male figure is certainly larger, but in others, like this one, the male figure is larger. The female figure is larger, pardon me, with Therona and Apollo Granus. Other evidence of a more egalitarian relationship exists, so we'll go through a few examples of divine pairings, see how the cult was represented, and what we can learn from it. I'll start things off by looking at a prime example of a divine pairing, Jupiter and Juno. This is what people tend to think of when we talk about these pairings, a marriage between two deities, Hades and Persephone, for example. There are other forms of pairings like Persephone and Demeter, child parent, or Apollo and Diana, twins, who we'll circle back around to later. In Gaul, the Jupiter-Juno pairing is fascinating. She mostly appears on her own or on Jupiter columns and occasionally directly alongside Jupiter himself, like the image on the left. The columns are questionable ties because they generally have many, many deities present, which speaks to a small personal or group pantheon, if you will. But there's also a much more interesting connection between the two of them. Gaulish Jupiter took on the symbol of the wheel, a definitively Celtic image, likely through syncretism with Tyrannus, and is frequently displayed alongside his thunderbolt and eagles, which are much more Roman symbols. This wheel is transferred to Juno in several depictions, like the one on the right, along with thunderbolts in one statue. This transference of symbols is a core part of the Gaulish divine pairing, a cornerstone of the cult imagery. It can be used to identify pairings outside of their combined worship, indicating a unique blending of Gaulish and Roman practices. It's this sharing of power that gives us insight into the most widespread worship of a divine pair in Gaul, Mercury and Rosmerta. This pairing have a wealth of cult iconography across Gaul, both named and unnamed, and are the quintessential Gallo-Roman divine pairing. Rosmerta, with her Celtic name and classically inspired imagery, is certainly worshipped on her own in a few instances, but most of her depictions are alongside Mercury, who himself was independently worshipped in his Roman form. Both strong elements suggest it was a provincial cult, independent from worship in the capital. In Gaul, he was usually accompanied by his traditional symbols, the snake scepter caduceus, winged hat, petasus, cockerel, ram or goat, and tortoise. That being said, symbols like the torque and wine pot sometimes replace or complement his traditional purse, and the horned serpent makes several appearances. His purse also seems tied to the goat when it's present, as though invoking the horns of the serpent through proximity. These stand out as Celtic symbols mixed into a classical visual language, whether through syncretism with local deities like Cernunnos, or simply as recognizable symbols of prosperity and fertility introduced as a local form of worship. The statues and carvings themselves are also Gallified. Green describes many of these depictions as highly stylized, as though carved by Celts for Celts. Many of these cult images were, after all, crafted locally by artisans who had their own iconography and worldview to draw from, or imported. Eventually, this iconography became more consistent, but early depictions vary wildly. It's important to recognize that while Mercury isn't typically associated with a consort, he was worshipped alongside others in Gaul, particularly his mother Maia, but also the Matrone, and at least one other local goddess in that early stage of unstable iconography. These other pairings are significant when we look at Rosmerta, since her imagery also draws heavily from Maia's iconography. This classical imagery is quite recognizable, like the patera offering dish, the cornucopia horn of plenty. Her appearance is a bit more complex with influences of Roman matron garb in some cases, but also frequent depictions as a Gaulish peasant, which is a recurring theme in other pairings as well. She also takes on Fortuna's rudder in one depiction, and is even part of a Fortuna Matrone trio in Gloucester, rich with symbolism representing life and death. The rest of Rosmerta's classical imagery seems directly influenced by her Mercury pairing. The purse, caduceus, and variations on the petasus, like a winged diadem or just wings on her head like this image. She also takes on the horned serpent, but as a goddess with a Gaulish name, it's not clear if this symbol of prosperity would have already been associated with her prior to Romanization, or when that Romanization began. It's curious that the petasus undergoes some changes to fit Rosmerta, since the others seem to transfer directly. Unlike Juno, who took on symbols traditionally held by her male consort, Rosmerta takes on only the purse, which is no surprise for her goddess prosperity, and the caduceus, which is sometimes held by other messengers like Iris. The transformation of the petasus into a feminine symbol, the diadem, is curious, and runs counter to the gender ambiguity of the other symbols. This shared cult seems to have held more tightly to recognizable Roman gender roles than other pairings, particularly with little reversal of the symbol transfers to Mercury, and little gender ambiguity in their representations. But why the symbol sharing between these two deities, and what can we glean about the nature of their relationship and worship? The first possibility, without straying too far from the theory of state-approved marriage, is that this pairing represents a fully anthropomorphized marriage between a god and goddess, and that Rosmerta plays the role of a Gaulish wife, a role different from that of a Roman wife, particularly during the reign of Augustus, when this cult was solidified. She takes on the symbols of her husband in a way that is reminiscent of Celtic queens who ruled in the stead of their husbands, widowed like Boudica, or otherwise like Queen Med, of Gaelic myth. This perspective at least takes into account theories about Gaulish perspectives on gender, where women wielded power in their society in a way that was somewhat foreign and even scandalous in Rome. It's far more likely that the subjugation of Rosmerta, especially when we recall that these depictions were made by Gauls for Gauls. It's not to say that Gaulish society wasn't patriarchal, nor that Gaul was consistent in its gender roles. Each tribe had political and likely religious autonomy from the next, though conquest, trade, and alliances certainly spread ideals. In this map from Deo Mercurio, it shows the distribution of worship to Rosmerta and her equivalents showing how patchwork Gaulish religion could be. But I put forward that without a size difference and with the influence of Celtic gender roles, their shared symbolism, that the worship of Mercury and Rosmerta held little conquest in its imagery. But also to limit their relationship to a marriage is also narrow-minded. It's possible that Rosmerta was an existing Gaulish goddess that stepped into a Maya-like role, again, drawing attention to their distribution on the map. Their shared imagery, and also Rosmerta and Mercury's connection to the Matrone. In fact, their symbolism of prosperity, success, health, and the balance between life and death imply a similar worship to the triplicate goddesses of the Germanic provinces. Finally, there exists a third possibility based on how similar their worship seems to be. Mercury's ties to trade and prosperity match well with Rosmerta's prosperity symbolism. Meanwhile, the Roman god's psychopomp nature fits well with the Gaulish goddess's life and death symbolism, if slightly less subtle. If these two deities were the same gender, there would be little doubt that they were being syncretized, as is immediately done with Rosmerta and Fortuna and Mercury and Cernunnos, despite much less evidence. Their shared symbolism builds the case for a widespread worship of Mercury and Rosmerta as being one and the same in many cases. A tidy invocation in all matters of trade, harvest, good health, and good luck, either in this world or the next. This practice could have become highly regional, depending on which aspect was being invoked, like the protection of flocks in Britain, where Mercury, Rosmerta, and the Geni Coculati all intersect. Curiously, there seems to be an interesting modern parallel for this kind of syncretism, but it's one that I don't want to dive into too deeply because it's a living, close tradition. See, Stephanie Mote from Newcastle University cites Joseph M. Murphy to revisit divine marriages in Gaul by examining the inherently syncretistic, polytheistic Santerian religion, which was formed when enslaved people, the majority following the Yoruba religion of West Africa, were forced to toil in Cuba, where the practice of any religion other than Roman Catholicism of their Spanish enslavers was outlawed. The reason that Mote draws this comparison is because some of these Santerian syncretisms cross the gender lines. What's interesting is that the worship of pairings like this involves a public face that passed inspection as Catholic, but with additional innocuous symbols that held and continue to hold secret meaning of great significance to practitioners. Mote distinctly does not draw a comparison between the situations of non-enslaved Gauls in the Roman provinces versus victims of the transatlantic slave trade for obvious reasons. Where she does draw a comparison is between this form of syncretism and that of Gallo-Romans. See, where Romans believe that each god has multiple aspects, like Juno Lucina for childbirth and Juno Sospita in a martial capacity, the Celts may have combined this with the belief that deities are untethered to mortal concerns like gender. To back this up, Mote references Miranda Green, who has written some of the best works on interpreting Celtic artwork and symbolism. She builds a case for Iron Age Celts holding views about gender that at the very least include a third liminal gender, if not viewing gender as a spectrum. Starting with depictions in art, it becomes very clear that Iron Age Celts had no hesitation in applying masculine and feminine characteristics to humanoid figures. Beards commonly decorate the faces of certain figures, while breasts are exposed for others, like these two on the Gundestrup cauldron. Their torques and massive sizes relative to the other figures are usually interpreted to indicate divine status, though it could presumably indicate that they are royalty. Regardless, this brings interesting implications to this familiar panel. The figure usually assumed to be Cernunnos is sometimes referred to as a seated male figure, perhaps because of the horns, or the antlers, I should say. But Green also posits in the world of Druids that antlers were drilled into by Iron Age Celts for use in ritual purposes, and we're also aware of female Gaulish figures with antlers. Furthermore, Gérard Patonneau draws significant comparison between Cernunnos and Dionysus, himself a deity of no fixed gender, or perhaps a liminal gender, who also exists on the boundaries of society. Dionysus is also able to shapeshift, which is an ability ascribed to Celtic deities by certain scholars, generally pointing to human-faced animals in Gaulish art as examples. The idea is that divinities, able to transition between worlds, aren't held back by the boundaries between species, much less sex or gender. Green also theorizes that certain members of society charged with crossing the boundaries between worlds might also exist outside of gender boundaries, evidenced by contemporary sources about Greek and Germanic priests richly dressing in women's clothing. And perhaps some grave finds, but these are complicated by early archaeologists' quick assumptions about sex and gender when looking at grave goods. We also see a gender ambiguous figure in this panel of the Gundestrup cauldron, often interpreted to either be sacrificing or reviving warriors in the cauldron. The cauldron in the image, not the one formed by these panels. I've seen this figure referred to as a goddess due to the long hair, ponytail, hat maybe on their head. I've also seen it referred to as a male figure reminiscent of Bran the Blessed from Welsh mythology. Regardless, between the dog on the next to the vessel, the figures being carried by horses away from the cauldron, which have their own chthonic symbolism, and the horned serpent, a decidedly otherworldly figure, leading the newly sacrificed away from the cauldron, lead me to conclude a particular direction. But the presence of the figure, with no representation of sex characteristics between these two states, places them in a liminal position. We also see many neutral depictions beyond the Gundestrup cauldron. The figure on the left was found in modern-day Deal, Kent, and is usually called the Deal Man, despite a complete lack of features other than a face. This figure was carved from chalk and is attributed to the 1st century AD, roughly. It's certainly possible that the figure was intended to be clothed, but there's a wealth of other finds with similar face and nondescript body from across Gaul. Whether they represented deities or individuals, gender ambiguity is a running theme in Gaulish art, as is the existence of dual sex representations like the boar with tusks and teats in the above image, and many of quote unquote bullhead images in Gaulish art, which could easily represent cows or more likely ambiguous bovines, regardless of sex or gender, taking on a liminal position in this art. This animal symbolism was well recorded in Celtic art, and the lack of defining characteristics on humanoid figures and the liminal nature of those who sit between our world and the next all lead Green to conclude that not every depiction of a divine pairing should be viewed as heteronormative, both due to the unfixed nature of Gaulish deities' gender and the possible androgyny of figures like Gaulish Apollo. Now, Apollo's cult was very strong in Gaul and has deep roots. In Noricum, Belinus and Apollo were syncretized very early, and he quickly found purchase in the many, many healing springs across Gaul. His partners were varied, quite similar to Rosmerta in imagery, and were mostly Gaulish in name, continuing the Roman god, Gaulish goddess formula. But Gaulish Apollo followed a slightly different formula from Gaulish Mercury, who was mostly worshipped solely as Mercury, but sometimes with Celtic epithets that identified region or ability. Apollo, on the other hand, was largely syncretized with different Gaulish names, each of which was rather regionally constrained, but the cult was consistent between them. I've listed some of the greatest hits here, but Whitacus lists nearly 24 on his site, Deo Mercurio. Apollo's rare depictions showed little Gaulish influence, depicting a youthful, soft-featured figure, often naked and with a lyre. However, early Gaulish Apollo worship avoided depictions, with the bronze figure shown here being a rare example of only a few Celtic Apollo statues, mostly, if not all, from the 2nd to 3rd centuries AD. Instead, the symbolism of the Celtic healers was more commonly evoked by name rather than depicted. Granus and Belinus speak of light, Boruo and Moritascus of water. But most interestingly, 2 have feminine cognates. Belinus, Belisama might be a bit of a stretch, but I've seen them paired quite a bit. But Bormanus and Bormana were worshipped together, and their names are direct gender reversals of each other. It's possible that these pairs speak to the gender bending implied by Gaulish art. And it's possible that Roman Apollo's lack of beard, paired with external sex characteristics, could have implied a gender liminality to the Gauls, either pubescent one or one tied to that role between society, which was unbeknownst to their Roman neighbors. To quote from Green, analysis of Apollo's function reveals certain elements of liminality. Prophecy, healing, music, and hunting are all associated with boundary transgression. It's possible that Apollo was adopted early, taking root in healing springs popular with Roman allies in a form recognizable to Gauls, now with a new name to syncretize with local spirits, and in an androgynous form to syncretize with local healing spring goddesses. It would have also resulted in a Gaulish, Roman-approved form of worship, with possible occult meaning, ready to spread to areas looking to Romanize their own local healing springs. This would also explain the massive relationship web of the Celtic healers, since it wasn't just Apollo's epithets that were highly varied, but also his consorts. As we saw before, the Celtic healer goddesses retained Gaulish names, but unlike Rosmerta, they didn't stick to one partner. Therona was paired with both Granus and Borwo, Demona with Borwo and Moritascus, Bormana alongside Bormanus, and each was worshipped independently as well. We can also learn quite a bit from their names. Therona's name is tied to stars, Demona is the great cow, and Bormana, like Bormanus, shockingly, is a goddess of hot springs. The latter two, though, were more local and haven't yielded any depictions that I could at least identify. Therona, on the other hand, is the most well-known of the Celtic healers, largely thanks to her far-reaching worship from Brittany to Noricum, her distinct imagery, snakes, eggs. I say corn, but we all know that that was a quote-unquote New World crop, and a diadem. She had a temple built atop an earlier wooden site as well. With her partner Apollo Granus, she was especially worshipped among the Belgic Treveri, although their cult spread as far as modern-day Hungary. They were also worshipped among the Aedui, but so were most divine couples. The Aedui loved divine couples. With Therona, we also get another reason to suspect these pairings were not marriages of dominance. Like Rosmerta, not only were the pairs depicted in similar sizes, but her imagery was quite similar to that of her consort's mother, Hygeia, who also appears alongside Apollo in Gaul. This is a more likely equivalent than Diana, who Therona is sometimes associated with due to her pairing with Apollo. But Diana had her own successful cult in Gaul, and what was more often paired with Sylvanus, like I mentioned, the hammer god, than Apollo. So motherly role for Therona seems more likely. This introduces an interesting question. Could Apollo have become syncretized with Therona due to her existing symbolism, or was her symbolism influenced by Apollo's cult? I mean, the answer is likely a mix of both, particularly since the introduction of Apollo into Gaul would have been a long, slow process. I mean, Romans really liked healing springs and had a long history of trade with Gaul before Caesar ever came along. The consistency between the Mercury, Rosmerta, and Apollo Therona cults is nonetheless fascinating because it implies a possible reversal of the original marriage of dominance theory. Perhaps the Celtic goddess is, in fact, the more ancient deity. Both Rosmerta and Therona have recurring symbols of fertility, largely of the land, and rebirth. This consistency between the two goddesses, and many others we'll see soon, might imply a more widespread, consistent practice among the Gauls, with younger Roman gods seeming to join them. And yet there's evidence that this pairing structure preceded Romanization thanks to one unique symbol, the hammer, which is conspicuously missing from most Sucellos depictions. But typically identifies Sucellos, the hammer god breaks the mold for Gaulish gods, remaining wholly Celtic long past Romanization, being so widespread despite the highly regional nature of Gaulish religion, and occurring so often by himself, easily identified by his long-handled mallet. But it's as a consort that I find him truly fascinating, and a reversal from the Celtic healers. Unlike Celtic Apollo, Sucellos was depicted far and wide, usually bearded, clothed as a Gaulish peasant, with symbols of protection and prosperity. Alongside his mallet, he was often found holding a small pot like this, a Celtic symbol equivalent to the Roman patera offering dish, thought to be for wine, or often some other symbols usually tied to wine, jugs, barrels, sacks. These could be meant for other crops, depending on the region. As I mentioned earlier, the Aedui, early allies of Rome from the Burgundy region, loved divine pairings, and they also loved to produce wine. So in their depictions, Sucellos and his consort are certainly thanked for the prosperity brought on by this crop. But the heavy Roman influence on the Aedui didn't stop them from breaking the rules of Roman iconography. Sucellos is shown holding a cornucopia in one depiction, and a patera in several others, both within and outside of Aedui territory. If we were to read into this addition of traditionally feminine symbols into a god depicted in a typical masculine fashion, it gives a few possibilities. It's possible that Gauls adopted Roman symbols without understanding arbitrary gender norms associated with them. If that's the case, then these depictions would have faded away, but I'm not sure if that's the case because I couldn't find each depiction and date it. Like I said, there's a lot of Sucellos depictions. The other possibility is that Green's theory about the fluidity of divine gender applies quite well to this Celtic god, but didn't spread to the Roman gods who were brought into the format of divine pairings. It's possible that as Gallo-Roman religion developed, Roman gods held to Roman depictions, especially if the state was keeping a close eye on approved religious depictions. Again, Augustus wasn't exactly known for his liberal gender views. A Gaulish god like Sucellos could have been spared these rules and been depicted with the cornucopia and patera, revealing the true gender ambiguity of these symbols in Gaul, giving us a glimpse into an earlier form of these divine marriages to this entirely Celtic pairing. Now, generally, when we think of a consort to Sucellos, modern Gaulish polytheists immediately think of Nantosuelta. She was, after all, frequently depicted alongside him, named or otherwise, and she also carries unique iconography that makes her easy to identify, like the house shrine on a pole and raven. But her worship was really regional, which isn't surprising considering her name is often translated as something along the lines of valley between two rivers, which is pretty localized as far as names go. But the hammer god was much more widespread, and so were his partners. In the Rhineland, he appears on a Jupiter column alongside Diana. Again, she was paired with Sylvanus in Gaul, who was syncretized with Sucellos, so no surprises there. But most of his pairings are unassuming. Gaulish peasant clothing, young face, symbol of prosperity. Where scholars have implied that this goddess must therefore be a single deity or an aspect of Sucellos, I think the actual answer lies in, once again, the regional nature of Gaul. To quote Ancamna, regarding the decentralized structure of Celtic society, in which each tribe functioned as an independent political unit, the inference being that political autonomy was coupled with religious autonomy, and that each tribe had its own special gods, which might or might not be common to neighboring tribes. Which leaves us with a likely range of regional goddesses appearing alongside the hammer god, himself possibly a regional variant, whose iconography grew more consistent over time or spread. With their depictions, the factors we've looked at before, let's take a look at a popular theory about divine pairings, the Celtic underworld goddess. With her more youthful appearance, it's possible that the hammer god's consort is more of an immortal figure, while his bearded face and imagery of mortal work like crafting, growing, winemaking, implies a status akin to Hercules and Smith gods. This theory pulls from later Welsh and Irish mythology, particularly stories of chthonic queens marrying a mortal, granting him sovereignty, usually with themes of hunting and otherworldly travel. When combined with Hallstatt and early Latin practices of burying chieftains and other prominent figures in significant, often defensible locations like atop a hill, we get the possibility of a deified ancestor, a king from ancient times who was quote unquote married to the land via burial and transported to the other world to rule over the tribe alongside the queen of the land. I could go on about this for a long time. I don't necessarily want to get too far into the weeds, but suffice to say, this is quite the reversal from the Rome-centric interpretation where the god would be the dominant figure in one of these pairings, because it implies that the goddess is the dominant figure in the relationship, granting the male figure kingship or even deification. Now, if this pairing does represent a deified ancestor and a local goddess of the land, then their combined worship becomes even more evident. Rather than the pairing of a male and female figure implying fertility through procreation, something unsupported by most, if not all, of the iconography we've seen so far, we get a cult focused on the nature between mortals and their environment and the prosperity gained through this union. The effort put in by the hammer god, his protection and friendliness, is representative of the work put in by the worshippers to shape the land and its gifts into life's bounties, while the goddess provides raw potential. Neither is sufficient on its own, but combined, they're a powerful source of prosperity. Their simple clothing and mostly domestic private worship indicates that this bounty was taken to a very personal level, a familiar format for everyday Gauls, the prosperity of collaboration between humans. I want to touch on a few other couples before getting to the end, because there's at least one other common pairing we should examine, a few unique ones worth looking at. To start, Mars and his consorts. Now, I'm once again referring to these couples by the name of the male partner, because unlike Celtic Apollo, Mars was a widespread god in Gaul who was syncretized with local Gaulish deities and paired with numerous consorts. Though unlike the healers, they were generally so regional that each pairing was unique. So Mars is the easiest way to refer to them as a group. It's also hard to delineate these from the healers because a lot of these pairings were frequently worshipped at healing springs with votive body parts deposited. But this speaks to the role of Mars in this capacity, somewhat closer to his original Latin form, a protector, not only in war, but mostly of disease, crops, and matters of wealth. Gaulish Mars's imagery varied wildly, with a few consistencies. Weapons, either literal or figurative, and nudity. This figure doesn't show that, but it was a quite common depiction. Whether this lack of clothing was inherent to the imported classical depiction or reference to Celts charging into battle in the buff is quite debatable. But the weapons are interesting because they also were paired with other imagery, usually healing or prosperity. The consistent theme here is protection against evils. So these Marses are often thought to be paired with petatus figures or local deities' protection and prosperity specific to that region or tribe. which ties pretty nicely into the previous theory about deified ancestors warding the community from evils. I also want to touch on another possible theory where in regions where Gaulish Mars was a god of prosperity specifically, maybe he served as a patron of mercenaries. Not only was mercenary work popular among Celts from the Hallstatt era and beyond, it also required a strong ruling couple. Grave finds indicate a shift from solely male rulers to powerful queens around the end of the Hallstatt period and early Latin, as I mentioned when I was talking about Rosmerta. These queens may have taken command during times of war, ruling locally while a chieftain or king was in the field, and sometimes never giving that power back up. In this case, the divine marriage may actually reflect the partnership required for prosperity in war, a warrior, the armed Mars, and a ruler who ensures the harvest continues as required, evidenced by his consort with the cornucopia. An added layer of complexity is added to the pairing, perhaps deifying an ancestral queen as well as a king. Meanwhile, Mars's consorts had a range of names and imagery consistent with the previous goddesses of plenty, but many were also unnamed. Each has their own minor differences, usually based on the context of the name, the location, and small elements in the depictions. One prime example is actually in Britain, where a matrona-like figure is paired with an armed Geni Kukulati, very regional with implications of fertility and flock protection again. These goddesses are all quite similar to the unnamed consorts of the hammer god, who he himself could be a particular variant on the Celtic Mars. Now, one variation on the pairing that's usually attributed to the hammer god Nantosuelta is Ericera and Dispater. With two different distinct regions of worship between the two pairings, it's possible that they serve similar roles, especially since Caesar names Dispater as a significant figure in Gaulish religion. Dispater and Ericera have deep chthonic imagery, but the others have more subtle elements. Mercury's ties to the underworld as a psychopomp, things that are a little less in your face. And it's not clear if Dispater stepped, it could be due to Dispater's direct influence, but it's not clear if he stepped directly into the role of a Celtic god, or if he was merely paired with Ericera in the familiar format due to her own underworld symbolism. Now, as I mentioned when I was talking about the horned figure on the Gunstrup cauldron, there exist depictions of various horned figures, but also of Cernunnos with a pairing. Considering the widespread use of his symbols for prosperity, the torque, purse, horned serpent, it's unsurprising. But the depictions themselves are unusual. At Somericor, he appears on a pillar feeding two horned serpents from a bowl. On a pillar across from him, a female figure feeds one of the creatures and holds a regenerative symbol of pomegranate, hinting at cycles and rebirth. At Saint, a now headless figure is cross-legged with a torque and purse, shown here. His companion holds a cornucopia with a much smaller figure, if you look on the right, next to her, possibly holding a matching symbol of plenty. Now, in the back of the depiction, I haven't been able to see this image, but it's described in one of Green's writings. Carving shows an antlered, cross-legged figure seated between a male and female one. No indication of why we can tell if it's a male and female figure, but it's odd to see these triplicate pairings alongside divine pairings, and I'll get into that again a little bit later. Now, there exist a lot of other depictions of pairings, especially in the territories of Aedui, the Santones, Lueci, and Mediomatrici, which were hubs of pairing worship. It's thought these regions, the unnamed depictions, were of other pairings without their recognizable symbols, like, say, Nantosuelta without her house shrine, and Sucellos without his hammer. So we could have numerous depictions of the same deities, or we could have highly regional pairings that we just can't identify because we don't have a name or any unique symbol to identify them with. These regions also represent a widespread across all of Gaul, with notable examples outside of these territories as well, like in Britain and into the Balkans. It's clear that the practice of divine pairings had significance for the Gauls. I've presented quite a few theories, but let's review which make the most sense, which were quite regional, and which can be brought into our practice today, or at least that I'll be bringing into my own gnosis. First, I think we can eliminate dominance by Rome. It just seems like an unlikely reason for these marriages. The crafting by Gauls, and not just Gaulish men either, as often assumed by early scholars, but after several years of brutal warfare, the society would have shifted quite a bit. It just makes it seem like these deities that were the same size and sharing symbols were at least mostly equal. The idea that the male-female pairings implicitly imply fertility through reproduction is also barely addressed in the iconography. We get Gaulish Mars and Apollo and sometimes Mercury appearing nude, but like themselves frequently, but it's quite rare that they're alongside nude consorts. These pairings where that happens may imply a more direct sexual fertility, but they're not consistent across all the depictions and seem specific to individual instances of worship. Instead, I think considering the implications of a mother figure in these pairings, like Therona Hygiea and Rosmerta Maya, brings us to the Gaulish lady with the mead cup, the role in which a goddess of the land grants sovereignty to the male figure. In this role, the goddess takes on a more primordial one, where power combines with the power of the possibly ancestral god to create a good harvest, to heal disease, to bring forth prosperity in all endeavors, and also to transition worshippers well into the afterlife. Now, a pet theory of mine is that this could also tie the divine pairings into the popularity of mystery cults of the later Romano-Celtic cultures. Isis and Osiris, Cabell and Attis shown here, Demeter and Persephone, maybe even the Bacchic mysteries, which flourished later and might have been tied to that gender liminality I discussed earlier as a god mostly associated with death in Gaul. And also Mithraism, where the mortal ascends to godhood by fusing with the sun, which of course ties into that whole ancestral side that I talked about. These mystery cults may have provided a base framework for already occult worship, presenting an imagery ripe with hidden symbols introduced into the Greco-Roman format. Another fusion from one divine pairing to another wouldn't have been a big leap, particularly if symbols happen to align. Now, the gender ambiguity of these symbols and divinities put forward the likelihood of a cross-gender syncretism, worship as one being that may have required coded symbolism to pass muster in a Roman province. Deities like Bormana and Cernunnos support this theory, but it's difficult to prove when the theory is predicated on pre-Roman art, and the majority of iconographic evidence comes from the Gallo-Roman period. But I would say it's enough to strengthen the general view in the Gaulish polytheism community, as I've talked to people, that divine pairings simply speak to the overlap between deities and their powers. But as we've observed, the existing evidence points towards that 1 + 1 = 3 formula, so common in syncretism. Namely, the result of divine and therefore mortal pairings resulting in success. These pairings honor the collaboration of the divine in the same way that collaboration between people can yield powerful results, evidence in the symmetry and closeness of the figures, and of course the symbols of prosperity that they hold between them. Here we can see two different depictions of Sucellos and Nantosuelta, where they're each holding symbols in the same way over their shoulder. Green also points to one unnamed depiction in particular, where bread, wine, and money are all symbolized, encompassing most peasants' hope of life. Nourishment in the next world is also a prominent theme, tying in ancestor worship if it's not already evident from the figures themselves. She also touches on triplicate deities, which usually display multiple facets of a single entity, whereas the pair gain strength from each other's support and celebrate the joys of plenty when times are good. This explains the cult's presence in homes at small domestic altars, depicting humbly dressed familiar figures to Gaulish peasants. For this reason, I put forward that the divine pairing is, in fact, the often searched for hearth goddess nobly missing from the Iron Age Celtic record. It's an ancestral, domestic, syncretic deity worshipped by the common people in their homes. So what do we do with this personal gnosis? I think we can consider a few guidelines. First, the quote-unquote pairing should fit your form of domesticity. The whole point of the divine pairing is to have a recognizable, comforting image that resembles whatever prosperous life you want, or whatever that looks like. It's the key to modernizing this practice, which doesn't have to be heteronormative, representative of monogamy, or even of romantic relationships. Make it your own and celebrate the people who support you in your life, or those who inspire you, which brings me to the next point, which is ancestor worship. As someone who's drawn strongly to the allegories of the hunting myths that imply the ancestral status of the male figure that I mentioned earlier in Welsh and Irish comparative mythology, I really think that tying ancestral worship into this practice is important. As a syncretized hearth deity, this pairing is intended to help connect you to ancestors and celebrate them. My ancestral practice is lacking, but if you saw my presentation last year, I'll be making sure that I have at least one horned or antlered animal present. But any psychopomp imagery or the horned serpent is more than welcome. I also think it's important to include the imagery relevant to your life. It should include some sort of protection against what ails you. So in my case, some healing imagery against chronic pain would be lovely. And the prosperity you and your family, chosen or otherwise, hope to gain. I'm currently trying to figure out gardening, so crop imagery might be useful, or something representing spiritual growth. Although the cornucopia, patera, purse, and wine pot, I brought them up over and over, were the most common symbols, there's a wide variety of others to draw from, like Ericura's key to the underworld for someone pondering their own mortality, or Thorona's snake and eggs for someone looking to transform into a new self. Finally, pick who you feel comfortable with. If you already have a relationship with a pairing, a deity, or you just want to explore some different forms of worship, I think I've shown there are so many options when it comes to these pairings. It might even be worth asking the deities directly through divination and engaging their interests. I'm currently working on a depiction of a deity and I'm involving them in the process. So why not play around with some different symbols? That's all I have to say on the topic, at least all I have prepared. As you can see, there were a lot of pairings that I wasn't able to get to. And this list doesn't even include many of the pairings I did mention, or more than one or two, I think, same-sex pairings, which is something I hope to explore now that I'm familiar with the language of the pairings. I want to keep looking into these depictions and see if I can find evidence of a more widespread cult that got ignored by a lot of these sources. So if anyone wants to explore them further, feel free to reach out to me. I also wasn't able to fully dig into a lot of the great sources I was found on the topic. Maury from Gal Chat in particular sent me several great papers on ancient world gender theory that I was barely able to sink my teeth into. So if you're more interested in that topic, please speak to them because they know way more than I do. And Whitticus, of course, I've referenced several times in this presentation. His site, Deo Mercury, is the go-to place for Gallo-Roman practices. And I believe he's presenting tomorrow for a Mercuralia ritual. But I learned a lot from him early on and while writing this presentation. And here I have my citations for images. So that's everything I have for the presentation. I see there's a few things in the chat. Kuna, have you been by chance seeing if there are any questions, or should I dig in and just see if I can find some?
There were kind of a couple. They weren't necessarily like direct questions, more like a lot of it was kind of comments, stipulation about the British English meaning of corn.
Oh, good. I noticed that right at the yes, corn can mean any grain of any kind. That's right. And I appreciate the correction for Maeve. Yes, I have not delved into Gaelic or Irish anything, so the pronunciation I have a very, very hard time with, so I appreciate that. Let's see here. Hygiea is Apollo's granddaughter. Oh, interesting. I feel like I may have mixed up my goddesses in that case. That is okay. Interesting.
We're not supposed to be experts on Hellenism. We can make mistakes.
I know. Oh, the amount of digging into you know as well as I do that there are so many rabbit holes when you're just starting to dig in. Someone says they didn't know there were same-sex divine pairings. Yeah, I quickly referenced Rosmerta and Fortuna. I'll see if I can find the image, but yeah, there was some really interesting imagery going on with them. And there's also one that I saw pop up that's a little, I don't know, it's more part of the, I forget the name, Capitoline triad. Is it Juno, Minerva, and Jupiter? So it's Juno and Minerva on the Jupiter columns. It's something that it's so hard to just look up, like, what were two goddesses in Gaul that were depicted together, because it's just scrolling through Esperandier and just trying to see what you can find.
Viticus did ask if you could revisit the connection between hearth deities and divine pairings.
Yeah, so where I went with that is that since these a significant portion of these depictions were small local altars in homes. There was certainly worship in temples like Mercury and Rosmerta, but it seems, from what I understand, the vast majority of them were worshipped in homes. And it's that idea of the two coming together to create more prosperity that I think just speaks to family, regardless of whether it's a marriage or anything else. I think that they just really represent the idea of community. And so having this altar in your home that represents the power that people coming together and living together and sharing and supporting and helping each other transition to the next life just really really speak to how they could be worshipped at the hearth, and especially the idea of ancestor worship being tied into that, which I think is a big part of the hearth culture. I'm not too familiar with hearth deities outside of Gaul because I'm quite new to polytheism, and I dove right into Gaulish polytheism without deviating anywhere else. So I think I need to dig into it a little more, but I think it's something that, as I mentioned, I started off looking with Gaulish Diana. So looking at Abnoba, which if you're attending tomorrow, we're going to have a reading from a new book about Abnoba, which I'm very excited about. I'm thinking of seeing if I can perhaps pair Abnoba and one of the other deities that I worship. I'm not sure, Tyrannos or Nodens, if they might fit. So I'm trying to do a divination process to see if maybe I might be able to get her and the other partner to answer directly and tell me if one would work over the other.